Michigan at Penn State. Michigan is a 4.5-point road favorite. The over-under set at 45.5. And by now, you don't need me to tell you everything that is going on off the field in the lead up to this game. And it is worth noting, as I record here, there's been rumors and speculation that the Big Ten may make a decision on Jim Harbaugh, may suspend him, Michigan may appeal it. But as I'm recording, there is no news. And as I'm recording, Jim Harbaugh is expected to coach this game. Obviously, by the time many of you listen, that may have changed, but just want to put it out there in the ether so there is no confusion. But that said, Michigan, of course, has been embroiled in scandal, but coming out of their bye last week, thought they looked pretty good against Purdue. You know you're rolling when you beat a team 41-13, and people said, oh, you don't look as dominant as you used to. You must have been doing something wrong. They took care of business. They were in complete control. They were up 20-0. And as I said on Monday's Aaron Torres pod, Purdue's points, 3 of them came when Michigan went for it on their own 34-yard line right before the half. Another touchdown came on the final possession of the game. And it was funny to see the public reaction to the game versus Jim Harbaugh's reaction at his Monday press conference. He threw out some stats that absolutely blew my mind in terms of how dominant Michigan was in that game. How about this for a couple stats? One, Purdue had a grand total of 1 drive that went more than 6 plays. 1 drive that went more than 6 plays. I believe there were either 6 or 7 3-and-outs in that game. And Purdue, like every single one of Michigan's opponents, has yet to run a play inside the 10-yard line against Michigan. This defense is dominant. What I do think is interesting, though, about this Michigan team specifically, the run game has not really gotten figured out all year. And by the way, that's not a Connor Stallions thing. They weren't running the ball well when Connor Stallions was on the staff. They didn't run the ball well last week against Purdue. And it was something Jim Harbaugh talked about this week. He said, I remember meeting with you guys last year, and you guys told me, hey, are you going to be able to throw the ball when it matters with J.J. McCarthy? Now we're throwing the ball well, but we're not running it very well. So that is an interesting thing to think about as we enter this game, especially because they are playing by far the best defense that they have played all year in Penn State. Now, to be clear, Michigan actually has played a couple good defenses, Rutgers, Nebraska. We'll get to that in a minute. But credit to Penn State. You know, listen, we know what happened 2 weeks ago against Ohio State, 3 weeks ago, really, at this point. But they bounced back nicely. And specifically, that offense has bounced back nicely, 30-plus points against Indiana. And then last week, 51 points against the Maryland Terrapins on the road. So things are finally starting to really click at a high level. Drew Aller, how about this? 20 touchdowns and 1 interception for Drew Aller. Probably played his best game of his career. And that's to go with the elite defense that Penn State is playing. Listen, I could sit here all day and just rattle off stats, but I thought it was interesting on that Maryland game that I just referenced. Brock Heward, who was calling the game with Jason Benetti, they basically said, pick any single defensive category in America. Penn State is top 10 nationally. I think Brock said it's 20-plus categories that Penn State is top 10 nationally. Scoring defense, total defense, run defense, red zone defense, pass defense. So they are elite across the board. And it goes without saying, this is going to be the toughest test that Michigan has faced. With that said, though, as we move into the transition of making a pick for this game, I actually do like Michigan in this game. And I do think we have to be careful with a couple of things. One, the Connor Stallion stuff goes without saying, right? But 2, like I was thinking about this. Everybody says, oh, Michigan hasn't played anybody yet. And like, there's no doubt this is the toughest environment that they'll have played in. This is the toughest team that they'll have played in, no doubt. But don't tell me they haven't played anybody, because they played Rutgers earlier this year. You're going to laugh. Well, what did Rutgers do against Ohio State last week? Rutgers was up at halftime against Ohio State. Rutgers has a top 10 defense in the country. Michigan put up 31 points, and that game wasn't close. Nebraska, top 20 defense in America, elite rushing defense. That was actually the game that Michigan had its best performance against on the ground with the run, 49 yards rushing. And so I bring it up. Don't tell me they haven't played anybody. By the way, I would say outside of Ohio State, Penn State has not played really elite competition this year either. I guess you could say Iowa's okay. I guess you could say West Virginia's okay. But I don't buy the notion that Michigan hasn't played anybody. And I would also say, well, I think everybody is focused on how does Michigan handle a step up in competition? Here's my thing that I don't think anybody's talking about. We saw Penn State against elite competition. It was not very good. Now, I get it. Ohio State is elite defensively, and Penn State played Ohio State on the road. So I get it. I get those that would say playing Ohio State at home or on the road is completely different than playing Michigan at home, especially in the middle of this scandal, especially with a lot of questions around this Michigan program. But we saw Penn State against an elite defense, and it did not go well. Does anybody, am I the only one that remembers Drew Aller and that Penn State offense against Ohio State? It was really bad. For people who have forgotten how bad it was, I'm going to pull up some stats for you that are, I don't know if they're going to blow your mind. It was really bad, though. Remember that game for Drew Aller. He finished that game 18 of 42 passing for 191 yards passing. Penn State was 1 of 16 on third down against Ohio State. Again, I get it's different on the road, but at the same time, to me, we saw this team against an elite defense. Drew Aller is not an elite athlete playing quarterback. Very strong arm, good arm. But you get him off script, you make him make plays with his feet, you get him uncomfortable out of the pocket, he struggled. I don't think Penn State has elite receivers. And so I look at this game, I still think the matchups favor Michigan. Better quarterback. Defenses are pretty equal. Penn State's run game is a little bit better, but they haven't really gotten it going either. And lastly, let me say this, and we're going to talk about this a little bit with Georgia here momentarily, because one thing I give credit to Georgia to, they're a very resilient team. But I think Michigan might be one of the most resilient teams that I could ever remember, okay? And it was funny because in the preseason, I talked about this. Michigan in the preseason was my national championship pick. By the way, for Penn State fans, they're like, oh, you're just picking Michigan because you picked them to win the national championship. I actually picked Penn State to go to the playoff as well. I picked Michigan to go 12-0, win the Big 10 EAST, and I picked Penn State to go 11-1 and beat Ohio State. So, in a perfect world, I'd love for all these teams to get in and make me look smart. But when I look at Michigan, I do think they're one of the more resilient teams I can remember, because think about everything they've been through and think about what we talked about in the summer. When I picked them to win a national championship, remember, Jim Harbaugh was suspended the first 3 games of the year. And what I said at the time, I said, I don't think this is going to affect them at all, because this team has been through more on the field, off the field adversity than anyone I can ever remember. Remember, it was 2 years ago, 2 off seasons ago, that Jim Harbaugh interviewed for the Minnesota Vikings job on the day of National Signing Day. And I remember coming on the next off season and saying, how can those guys trust Harbaugh and what are they going to do? And they're not going to be able to bounce back. And then what happened? They ran the table 13-0 going into the college football playoff before they lost to TCU. So I bring it up because I look at this team and I do think it's just going to be business as usual for them. Harbaugh talked about blocking out distractions, focusing on football, and I think they're going to be able to. I'd also say this too. I do think sometimes teams take on the personality of their head coach. We just talked about it with Harbaugh. It feels like all this stuff just kind of rolls off Harbaugh's shoulders. You see him at the press conference on Monday. He's talking about Ric Flair. I'm having a good time. Happy to be here. So thrilled. Love football, blah, 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 this and that. And his team kind of takes on that. James Franklin's teams kind of take on his personality too. They played tight in big games. They played scared in big games. James Franklin in the past, certainly against Ohio State, I thought he coached scared in that big game. And so I look at this game and I look at James Franklin and I look at how he's handled things. When this story broke a week ago, James Franklin, I don't want to say he was whining, but he was more outspoken than most. Now, this week he's kept it quiet. This week he hasn't given any bulletin board material. But last week it was, well, sometimes you just think you're in a perfect play call and they have a perfect answer to it. And you sit there and wonder, how did that all happen? Not calling him a whiner, but he's kind of a whiner. And when things go good, he's the best guy in the world. And when things go bad, it's whatever. And so I like Michigan to win this game. Do think it's low scoring. Do think having the better quarterback, the more experienced team on the road helps. Go ahead, give me Michigan. I'll say 24-10. Just because I don't think Penn State's going to be able to move the ball. Think the under is absolutely in play, but I am picking Michigan to win and cover on the road. Again, as I record here, Jim Harbaugh will be coaching Michigan. We'll see if anything changes between now and kickoff.